excited to introduce our guest for this evening. I'm not going to really start talking until Sarah gives me the green light for those who are joining us online, / remember that when we do live stream this, that it is going to continue to be on St. Matthew's YouTube and Facebook page. I think Facebook is now 30 days before they take it down, but YouTube will last forever. If there is someone for whom that you would like to share this conversation with. So I'm very excited to have Pastor Colby Martin here. So Pastor Colby is the author of currently 2 books. The first is Unclobber, Rethinking Our Misuse of the Bible on Homosexuality. And the second one is called The Shift, Surviving Something About Going from Conservative Christianity to More Progressive Christianity. I subtitled it yet. He's on it. He's working on it. Is it on down there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, then it's Dennis. Dennis got you. Don't worry.
Thank you, Dennis. Microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. Hey, wonderful. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
So I just want to start by saying one of the reasons that we have Colby here is I met Colby last year up in Maryland. I was voluntold by my bishop that you are going to have this Colby guy on your podcast, and I was like, oh, I am I mean, if the bishop says it, that's what happened. Anyways, I remember thinking, I was like, oh, he's like Baptist? I don't know about this. And then I read his book and was like, for a Baptist, that's pretty good theology. I am actually quite impressed. And so through getting to know Colby and learning more about his work, I just wanted to share Colby in this conversation of understanding the work that you have gone through. And so would you start by briefly telling us your journey of going from where you were to where you are?
Sure. Thanks, AJ. And thank you for having me here tonight with you. This fantastic concept called vintage. I just love it. So how fun for me to get to be a part of this with you this evening. Okay, so first of all, not to correct you, but I like to refer to myself as a recovering Baptist.
Oh, sorry.
So, yes, hi, my name is Colby, and I'm a recovering Baptist. Yes, but that is how I was born and raised. I came from a long line of Baptists and Mennonites, and growing up, our family was in church like 47 times a week, and it was just what we did. And so when I felt the call to ministry around 17 years old, right before I went into my senior year of high school, I had this encounter with God that I felt was an important moment for me to choose to go in a direction of giving my life to the service of God. And for me, that meant becoming a pastor. And so I was a pastor in the evangelical world for about 10 years. And then a series of events transpired that really was a couple years long of me, you might say, auditing some beliefs that I had been raised with, getting curious about some of the things that I'd been trained with in my, as I pursued my degree in pastoral ministry. And over time, I began to develop this distance between me and the evangelical heritage of my youth. And then if you've read Unclobber, or you're familiar at all with my story, you'll know that sort of the final break, if you will. I may be fighting this mic all night long, I'm not sure. Can't get it to stick on my head very well.
Use the other ear.
Use the other ear. This would be interesting. I like it if it works. Swing both ears. We'll see how that fits. Okay. No, that's all right. If there's a handheld mic, I don't mind that, but I just don't want to be a distraction all night as I try to do. Is this like shaped to Eric's ear? Is that why? He's just got a bigger ear? And you just got a large ear.
Well, if you get tired of fighting it, we can the handheld mic.
Yeah, I think I might prefer the handheld, just because I feel self-conscious about doing that all night long. Oh, no. Let's try that.
I have you off right.
Okay. Yes, I love that. Thank you. And now I can use the mic as a prop. Like if I want to get real intimate, I can. Okay, where was I? You've heard my story about 17 times now?
Yeah. I don't remember which part, but you became a Baptist pastor.
Oh, yeah. So I'm sort of slowly theologically drifting away from my evangelical roots. And then the catalyzing incident that was kind of my final expulsion out of my evangelical heritage was this moment in September 20th of 2011. It was a Tuesday night, I'll never forget. President Obama signed the repeal for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And if you recall, this was the ban against open gay service members in our military. And at that time, I was working at this large evangelical megachurch in Phoenix, Arizona. Don't recommend either Phoenix, Arizona, or the large evangelical megachurch for that matter. And I'm working there, but I'm having these constant sort of changes in my belief and my theology as my time there goes on. And prior to this repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I had investigated the clobber passages, which we may or may not get into tonight, but I had investigated them and determined that after careful study, after thorough examination, after using all of the tools of my trade to perform exegesis on the text and to put it in its literal, historical, cultural context, I came to the conclusion that the church had gotten the topic of homosexuality in the Bible wrong. And so I became what's often referred to...
And that's like really deeply entrenched in your word, right? Like you had to sign paperwork that says that you agree that these people cannot even become a part of the church.
That's right, yeah. So that was and remains part and parcel to what it means to have, to be an evangelical, is essentially to be anti-LGBTQ. And so for me to change my mind on that was a significant break from the heritage of which I was born and raised and trained in. But I kept that information to myself because I had a sneaky suspicion that if my church knew that I had changed my mind on it, it might not go well. And so I sort of lived in that state for about a year, where on the inside I believed a new thing, but on the outside I was still functioning as a pastor at this church outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And then the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell came. And I went to bed that night with the brilliant idea to post on Facebook a link to an article. Just such a great thing to do. If you have a thought, a political, theological thought, go to Facebook. This is just the best place.
Maybe you started it. That seemed to really catch on.
Just everybody, they're so civil, and everybody listens to each other. So I posted on Facebook an announcement of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and I put 6 words. I'm glad this day finally came. And I thought it was just an innocuous sort of agreement that, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a discriminatory policy. It's been repealed. That's great. We're all going to be happy about this, right? I go to bed that night, wake up the next morning to just a stream of people at my church commenting on there, like, why is our church now pro-homosexual? Or why are our pastors advocating for the gay agenda? Which I like to say that I've been an ally for 15 years now and still don't have my copy of the gay agenda. So if anybody knows where I can get this, I'm still looking for my copy. Anyway, to truncate the story a bit, I get to work, my boss asks me to take it down, kind of like you were, what did you say, voluntold? Yeah, I was just straight up told, take it down. Took the post down, thought that was it. Turns out there was an emergency board meeting 2 days later. I was called in to the elders to give an account of my theology on sexuality and my thoughts on same-sex marriage. And I finally, at that moment...
And you wrote a dissertation.
Oh, getting ready for this meeting, AJ, I knew that if I just went into this meeting and spoke from the heart or spoke off the cuff or extemporaneously, there's a chance I would kind of soft pedal it a little bit.
Yeah, no, you put together like a legal brief.
And so I typed out a 10-page, I think, single-spaced letter outlining all of my thoughts on the clobber passages, appealing to all of the ways that me and the elders had served together over the years, and then ended with, and can I keep my job? And so yes, called into this meeting, forced to give an account of my theology. I passed out the letter, read it through it with them. They asked a few follow-up questions. They dismissed me and said, don't come on Sunday, we'll fill your spot for you. Take the weekend off. And then when I came in on that Monday morning, they gave me a letter of termination effective immediately. And so that was like my final catapult out of the evangelical world. And so then I spent have spent the next 10, 12, 14?
This is a question for me that I've genuinely never asked you. Did you realize in that moment that you were putting your life and your family's security on the line for your theological conviction?
Yes. Yeah. Because the day before that meeting, I read the letter with my, so there was like 3 pastors on staff. I shared it with the 2 of them. And my boss says, Colby, if you read this tomorrow, this is basically your resignation letter. And in my mind, I thought, maybe not though. Like maybe I can appeal to the goodwill of the people who served on the board. But I pretty much knew what I was walking into. But I was just done living a split life where inside I had these ideas and convictions that I couldn't fully open up to be honest and open about. Yeah. So.
And you use the language having your heart and your head aligned.
Yeah. So for 5 years before that event happened, there was this moment, this was shortly after college, where I was working on getting ordained in the denomination that I was working at. And that was the first, I was reading through the policies and procedures manual to get ready for the ordination process. Riveting reading. If you ever want to read the policies and procedures manual of the Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination of the Pacific Northwest, you'll love it. But there's this one phrase in there that I'm reading on my lunch break. And it said, practicing homosexuals cannot be members of the church. And I remember thinking to myself, practicing? But what if they're like really good at it?
You got one.
Hallelujah. Okay, that wasn't really what I thought. But I thought, okay, practicing homosexuals can be members of the church. At the time, I was deeply entrenched in my Baptist evangelical theology, so my mind said, yes, I get it. Being gay is a sin, it's not God's design. Totally, my head was there. But for the first time, I noticed that my heart, was in a different spot. I remember thinking, wait, so that's like the practical outworking of this theological position? They can't be members of the church? And then I kept reading, they can't serve as an elder, they can't serve in children's ministry. They can give up their tithes and offerings. Sure. So that was the moment where I first noticed this disconnect between my head and my heart that I didn't reconcile until years later, in about 2010, which set me up for the fire.
So you go into this process as a conservative, evangelical, straight man, and you're like, I think maybe I just need to do this work and look into this.
Yeah.
Why did you do that?
Yeah, I remember meeting a guy. This was after I got fired, and I was in the process of interviewing for a new church. And he was the pastor of this church, and he was a gay man pastoring the church. And he said, so who was it, Colby? Was it a brother, a cousin? I said, what do you mean? And he said, who was it in your life that came out of the closet that forced you to then rethink your theology? Because this is so often how people's journeys unfold. Yeah. Because they have someone close to them that comes out, and
they meet someone, and they're like, oh, I guess they're not like a horrible
yes,
person.
I've known you my whole life, and I know this about you, and now I know this piece of information about you. And so a lot of people have that experience. For me, though, up until that guy who asked me that question, I didn't have any gay friends, or any gay family members. I didn't really know any. I mean, looking back now, I know that I did know people, but so to your question, for me,
you weren't a safe person to talk to back then.
Certainly not, no. And for me, my desire to find the alignment between my head and my heart on this issue was solely motivated by my theological and personal desire for integrity. Like if I was going to believe something, and I wanted to know what it was I actually believed, and I wanted to be able to have like a real conviction in it. And when I noticed that my head and my heart were in different places, I knew at some point I gotta rectify that. And going into my study,
yeah, you went into it being like, this might go any direction.
Yeah, I was prepared for that. I was prepared to study the clobber passages and have one possibility be, I kind of agree with the traditional conservative position, so heart, sorry, but you're going to have to figure out how to be okay with this. But fortunately, spoiler alert, that's not what happened. Yes, I came to the conclusion that we've gotten this topic wrong, that the Bible does not say what so many of us have been told that it says. And so in this case, my heart was kind of leading the way on that.
Can you tell me, like, in your experience, in your reading of this, why it is that is largely the plain side that everyone decides that we're at? I didn't tell you that was going to come up. That just came up.
No, you're fine. I'm trying to think of how I want to start this response. One way to respond to that, AJ, is...
That actually is like basically the same thing as my question number 2. If you say it absolutely makes sense to be an affirming Christian,
Which I do.
which you do, and we're going to give you all the answers because then there's no reason to read the book. I have copies. I'll give it to you. It's fine.
Or you can buy them from me, which is even better.
Yeah, that's true. And Colby will be selling books and signing them in the back when we're done talking.
You can buy it from Amazon and give Jeff the money.
Yeah. You can buy it tonight with cash, card, Venmo. Anyways. But you say if it absolutely makes sense to be an affirming Christian, why are most Christian churches still not affirming?
Okay, so 2 thoughts on that. And before I get to the second one, I'll start with the first one. Which I don't know why I told you that. You don't know how I ordered them. I could have just gotten right into it. Okay, why do I do this? The first thing I'll say is an attempt to normalize the process of something being the way we've always thought about it until it isn't. There's many examples that you could pull from to illustrate this reality.
Like Galileo?
What's that?
Galileo?
So Galileo is certainly one, right? So for many, many years, the church, along with the rest of the world, believed that the earth was the center of the world and that the sun, or center of the universe, and the sun moved around it. And then Galileo comes along with like math and suggests that no, maybe the sun is the center and the earth goes around it. And the church said, thanks, Galileo, we're so grateful that you illuminated us to the truth. So up until, that's a joke. For all of you Galileo heads out there, you were with me.
They did, I think it was about 5 years after his death that the church sent a formal apology.
But they even have Bible verses to back up their position, right? That the earth is the center. So, and then you can go back even before that. I was thinking earlier today about when you see the early church first start to gain some momentum, obviously it's just the Jewish people at first. This was the assumption, is that this is a Jewish movement. There would be no reason to even think otherwise, because of course it's a Jewish movement. And then you have Peter falling asleep in this vision of from heaven. Hey, I've never eaten unclean things. And God says, don't you dare call unclean what I have called clean. And suddenly there's this moment where Peter has to accept, I've been wrong about this. And then he has to try to convince others that he's been wrong about it. And then he takes a few steps backwards. Did you know that in the book of Acts? Like, he starts to freak out, and Paul has to confront him to be like, yo, why do you show up in these places and put on your old Pete hat? That's my translation. Your old Pete hat. Like, come on. So we have all these examples, and you could pick another example. You could pick like slavery and segregation, okay? The dominant view for many, many years.
Oh, and supported by the Bible.
Yes, and supported by the Bible. So that's my first response, is just normalizing the experience of a thing can be the majority position for a really long time up until it's not anymore. And that's fine. And when I say that's fine, what I mean is it's okay to admit that we've had something wrong for a long time.
Yeah.
We've been here before.
Yeah.
We've been here before. So that's kind of...
Which is, just because I like to do this and sneak in because I didn't mean it to, but it did connect to what we talked about tonight. We are Lutherans. We are death and resurrection people. This idea that, like, we are always being made new, that God is always continuing to change us, to grow us, to evolve who we are in our relationship with God and one another. Okay, continue.
Yeah. So then the second thing I would say about why that is I think it's okay for us. I'm going to give you permission if you need someone to give you permission on this. It's okay for us to appreciate the historical reality that while, I would argue, gay people have always existed throughout human societies, certainly it has not been the case that gay people have been, for instance, asking to have a kind of marriage. That's a relatively new phenomenon, okay? So one of the things
well, and like that's loaded, right? Because the whole thing is like what we understand is, quote, biblical marriage the Catholic Church came up with at the Council of Trent not that long ago, and it just gets applied in this certain way, right? If you want to look at biblical marriage, right? Women are property, and we trade them for the amount of goats that their fathers negotiate, and like
you can have multiple.
you can have a lot of them. It depends how many goats you have to give away, right? Like you could, kind of figure that out, and we don't rarely do we accept that these. How many goats did you trade Laura for? Oh, I'm sorry, not you. I looked at Fran. Joe, how many goats did you trade Laura for? Just one? Going great, damn. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. So this is a fairly late concept. So even to compound that with this idea of sexuality, right? Like that wasn't a concept.
Totally.
You're the one being interviewed, not me. Continue.
AJ, come on now. It's a conversation. That was weird. I don't know what that was. But I think it's okay for us to name, hey, let's not expect the Bible to answer questions that nobody was asking. To say, what does the Bible say about same-sex marriage is like, what does the Bible say about the efficacy of investing in crypto? I don't know. Nobody was asking that question 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So it's okay, I think, for us to name that. Part of why it's been the majority for so long is because there wasn't a movement to push it back against it. There wasn't curiosity to go beyond So I think it's okay for us to name that we're living in a time that within the last several decades, last century, certainly heightened in the last several decades, we now have we're reaching a tipping point of more people saying, wait a minute, there's another way that we could experience what it means to flourish as humans as it relates to LGBTQ people. Yeah. Let's talk about that. So.
I want you to answer that really quick because I think what you say is really beautiful. I just want to throw in this little tidbit of information that I always find incredibly fascinating, is that the word homosexual gets put in the Bible for the first time in 1946. I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but there are people in this room older than that. Yeah. And to me that just boggles my mind. My grandfather had already fought a war before they came up with that stuff. And so, and there's a good movie about that. We'll watch it at some point in time about when, how, and why that translation or mistranslation, as they call it now, got into the Bible, where it is, particularly in the New Testament. But so what I want to ask, because this goes in some of our questions, so you read the book and you hear, you literally walk through the 6 clever passages and do some beautiful exegetical work on why this is saying maybe something a little bit different in context than what has always been told to us. But you say you have this position that to be Christian is should be beautifully to be a fully affirming Christian. What is your theology for that?
A theology for inclusion? To put it succinctly, I would say, considering that the Bible does not say anything about sexual orientation, because that's a fairly modern concept. So with the mere suggestion that the Bible has anything to say about homosexuality is right off the bat a red herring, because homosexuality is a term that describes parameters around a person's sexual orientation. The Bible just doesn't talk about sexual orientation because it can't. It just wasn't a concept that anybody was thinking about, asking about, talking about, let alone writing about. So homosexuality, considering the Bible doesn't say anything about sexual orientation, and considering that the Bible does not have anything to say about 2 people of the same sex that are in a loving, committed relationship with each other.
It actually doesn't really say a lot about loving, committed relationships.
No, it doesn't. And when it addresses, and this is what Clarver goes into, when the Bible has a few verses that seem to go near the territory of same-sex sex acts, what we discover is that it has nothing to do with the kinds of questions we're asking today. It doesn't address 2 people in a loving, equal, committed relationship.
It
Has to do with exploitation, has to do with economic transactions, has to do with judgmental postures towards people that you don't understand. These are the things that the Clarver passages deal with. So when you consider nothing about homosexuality, when you consider the Bible doesn't have anything to say against those who are in a loving, committed relationship who happen to be of the same sex, And when you consider that built into the Bible is what I call a divine preference for diversity. A divine preference for diversity, which is another way to say that is anytime you see a movement towards uniformity, conformity, where everybody looks the same, talks the same, thinks the same, that's a move towards empire. And in the Bible, anytime you move towards empire, you are moving away towards what Jesus talked about as the kingdom of God.
God's not into stormtroopers.
God is, in other words, stormtroopers is not what you should expect the kingdom of God to look like. There's a divine preference for diversity sprinkled all throughout the Bible. And there's also a trajectory in Scripture of ever expanding and inclusion. And you see this trajectory, you see this widening of the mercy of God and inclusion of people to the family of God. So when you consider, the Bible has nothing negative to say about the things we're talking about, and you see this beautiful depiction of preference for diversity and a widening towards inclusion, and when you consider what it actually means to be Christian, which for me just means you're trying to be a follower of the way of Jesus. This is what the original Christians were called, the followers of the way. Like you're trying to live like Jesus lived, where forgiveness is better than revenge, where mercy is better than sacrifice, where loving your neighbor and loving your enemy is like what matters most. When you consider all of that, then for me it's like, oh, to be a Christian, therefore it makes sense to be one who would also then affirm and include LGBTQ people. These things, this is the natural extension of what it means to follow Jesus.
So I have a question for you that I received some iteration of this question from 5 or 6 different people. But essentially says something like this. St. Matthew's is a purple congregation. And we know that, and we work through that. Essentially, what do we do? Or how do we have conversations with people that we love, with people in our congregation, people in our midst, that either use the clobber verses or don't seem to be willing to have any crack in the heart to do this kind of theology and become a welcome, opening community?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. Maybe that's the first thing to say, is just to name right out the bat. Trying to hold together a community like this is really hard. There's a reason why most of the world is divided between blue and red, right? Because this way is hard. I often think about the Apostle Paul and his experimentation, you could call it, of starting purple communities between Jewish people and Gentile people. There was no guarantee that was going to work. It's never been done before in history to mix people of that caliber and build a kind of communities like he did. Like, it takes guts, it takes courage. By the way, sometimes when you read Paul and you get this frenetic energy where you're like, whoa, bro, simmer down. But you can understand behind that is this, like, so much is at stake, y'all. We got to keep this thing together. So much is at stake. So that's the first thing I was to say is just a name. It's hard. You know what's easy? To go back to what I said a minute ago? Empire. Uniformity, conformity, where you just get everybody to look the same, think the same, talk the same. That's easy.
Most segregated hour of the week.
It sure is. It still is. Another thought that comes up for me in that is I'm going to speak to the more red-purple, and then I'll speak to the more blue-purple.
Okay.
Now I'm going to start with the blue-purple. You blue-purples, blurples. To you blurples in the room, if you're familiar at all with the letter to the church in Rome, what we call the Book of Romans, you may know that this was a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome to try and get this church, as I said a minute ago, to live in harmony. Because the church in Rome was fractured along ethnic lines between Jewish and Gentile Christians. When we call it chapters 14 and 15, when you get to those in Romans, you see that Paul is addressing like real things that are going on in that church. And he calls them weak faith and strong faith. And the weak faith are those who would not eat any meat. And the strong faith were those that knew, look, eating meat is fine. And Paul said, even I know that we can eat the meat, it's fine. But there are some among you who are weaker in faith it still violates their conscience to do that.
Right, the meat that has been sacrificed to the temple of the Roman gods.
Yeah, thank you. It wasn't just like vegetarian.
Yeah.
Very
It's
specific kind of-
very specific, like, oh my God, is this meat unclean? It's been given up to Zeus. Are we allowed to eat it?
Yeah.
We don't praise Zeus.
And the second topic was...
Paul's like, no, it's fine, it's just meat.
It's fine, he said. And then he said the other issue is about days, like the weak in faith think that like certain days have like this sacred holiness to them, and the strong in faith recognize that all days are the same, right? So Paul is sort of naming these two different communities. And what he says, and this is what I'm talking to the blurples first, is he says, I need you who are stronger in faith. I need you who are no longer sort of bound by these moralistic, legalistic interpretations of the law. I need you who are more liberal and open with how you practice your faith to defer your liberties to those among you who are still sort of stuck in what Paul, I think, he called it a weaker faith. I don't think he meant it as pejorative as it comes across, but I often think he thinks weak and strong because weak faith is like, it's fragile. It can easily be knocked off because it holds things.
If you start pulling the Jenga blocks out, the whole thing can
Yeah,
fall.
and a strong faith is rooted in, hey, look, the meat's fine. This is not going to sacrifice. This is not going to jeopardize your standing with God, right? And so he says for the strong in faith, look, for the weak in faith, this stuff still, because their conscience has violated it, for them, it's a bad thing. I want you to hold space for that. And this is a really challenging thing for me to say, by the way. Like, I can imagine a version of AJ and Eric right now being like, what? This is what we asked you to talk about? But there is a sense in which I do, and I preach this at my own church, because we weren't purple, but we did occasionally have some people show up, and it was really hard for me to look my progressive, look my queer friends in the eye and say, if we want to take Paul's advice, which you don't have to, that's another option. Is like, thanks, Paul, but we're not going to take your advice. But if you want to take his advice on how to do this, there's a sense in which those who are more liberal and are asked to defer your liberties. Okay, now, let me talk to the red pulls.
The Rurples.
The Rurples.
Since we're doing that.
This is really working well. I can see this is really going to stick. This is going to catch on here at St. Matthew's. Where I would caution you to not just hear what I said and be like, aha, see? Where I would caution you is the matter of sacrifice meat and the sanctity of days. This was not touching upon the inherent worth, dignity, or value of individual humans. When it comes to the matter of whether or not we affirm the inherent goodness and child of Godness in people who are different than we are, and in this case we could say LGBTQ people, when it comes to that, I think we might be talking about a categorically different conversation than whether or not you can eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols or whether days are holy or not. So to the Rurples that we went with.
Rurples, where we're at, yeah.
My word of encouragement is there may come a point in your journey of faith where a place like St. Matthew's does become more and more committed to be a place of inclusion and acceptance and full affirmation of queer people. There may come a point where you may, in your own heart, feel like, I don't know if in good conscience I can keep going here. And you may think, I may need to find somewhere else to worship. And that's always an option for you. Like, it's always an option. Of course, you can always go somewhere else.
Or
my invitation to you, though, my invitation to you is to sit in the tension, to sit in the difficulty of doing fellowship and life with people who are different than you, Trusting that at the end of the day, it's not up to you. It's just not. It's not up to me. Like, I actually believe that your faith in God, this is why I don't think weak faith, strong faith is super helpful, because I don't think your faith is weak as we would sort of think about it in English. I think you have a beautiful, like, deep...
I'll dive into the Greek sometime and maybe unpack those.
Yeah, you can take Romans 14 and 15.
Yeah,
I just threw that bomb out there. It's used to clean up the shrapnel. I actually believe, I believe in your commitment to your understanding of the faith. And so that means that I think you have a big faith in God. So lean into that. Lean into that. There's very few places in this world where we get to practice the tension of living with people who are different than we are. And church is a gift. This is Ronald Rolheiser in his book, The Holy Longing, talks about church as one of the few places left in the world where we get to practice doing life with humans who are different than us. So yeah, of course you can move on. That's always an option to you. But I think a future version of you will like you better if you stay and remain and practice grace and practice love. And you will never know what the future holds, okay? You never know. Because you're probably sitting right next to people who were where you were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now you see them and you're like, how'd you change your mind on that? Well, you're in a place, guess what? You're in a place where there is dozens of safe people to have that conversation with when you're ready, if and when you're ready.
Yeah, I had someone ask me, they're like, well, what can we do? And that was the only advice I could give. And I said, be a conversation partner for someone who needs it, right? And we don't know where that is or where anyone's at. And, you know, we even have a spectrum of allies over here. There's a spectrum of all the things. This is very, I've just seen use my hand over and over again, but it's very
Just seeing Reading Rainbow.
It's like Reading Rainbow.
That's it.
Okay, now second,
Yes.
I love it. Yeah, it's perfect. It's very Genesis to me of thinking about, you know, we have light and dark, and we sort of have the spectrum, and we have day, or that's the same thing, day and night spectrum. We have water and dry land, and then the marshes, the estuaries, all the plethma and everything in the middle, right? That we have all of the things. We have the water animals and the land animals and the ducks and the otters and all the other animals that do things. Reptiles is in that spectrum too, right? And then like we also have humans, right? That we exist in this spectrum too. God made them male and female and all of the in between.
I'm telling you, there's a divine preference for diversity.
Yeah, there is, and I love that. And so like when I think about like where we sit and how we live in this, is it's that same thing, is there's this spectrum of where we're at, of I'm fully here or I'm fully against here. That like there's room for everyone, and it's this understanding of diversity and how we work with that.
Yeah. Maybe you've heard of Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh, he passed away a few years ago. He's a Tibetan, or was a Tibetan Buddhist monk who did a lot of beautiful work showing the overlap between Buddhism and Christianity. And Thich Nhat Hanh, years ago, I came across a teaching of his that he was trying to provide a pathway for the command by Jesus to love your enemies. Because for Thich Nhat Hanh, he said like that's one of the demarcating uniquenesses of Christianity.
Yeah, I got to preach on that last week. Well.
Yeah, great. So Jesus, like how do you actually love your enemies? Practically, how does that work? And so this is the last thing I'll say to the Whirlpools in the room. One path for loving your enemies. Thich Nhat Hanh says, understanding leads to compassion, and compassion leads to love. Which means this: begin with understanding. Seek to understand a person's why. Why are they the way they are? Why do they think the way they think? Begin there. If it's someone that you're on the opposite side of any given issue on, maybe enemy, you're like, they're not my enemy. Okay, but in the sense of like being opposed on a particular issue, that is a lowercase e enemy for all intents and purposes. Start with understanding. Why? Why do they think that? Why are they the way they are? How did they get there? And Thich Nhat Hanh says, understanding then leads to compassion. And the compassion is the part of you that goes, oh, that makes sense. That's what compassion is. When you can be like, oh, if I was you, I would be you. If I lived your life, I would be just as where you are. That makes so much sense. And then that's the compassion. That leads to love, because once you're like, oh, that makes sense. If I were you, I would be you. Suddenly you realize we are all connected in the great family of God. All of us. All of us. All of us. And that's what opens up. Now suddenly they're not your enemy anymore. You see them as a fellow imago Dei. You see them as a fellow expression of Christ incarnate. You see them as a fellow child of God. And suddenly love becomes the natural expression of your posture. So begin with understanding.
And we're just doing, each of us are doing the best that we can with the understandings and worldviews and experiences that we have.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of holding space for understanding that people, every person comes with unique experiences.
Yeah.
Trauma, family, religion, that we all have this unique makeup of who we are and how we understand the world around us. And it's a matter of making space that where someone's at is in a different place.
Yeah. And making space and trusting that God is in charge of other people, not you. You know what I mean? Like, so often we want to control other people's spiritual path. And this is for both sides of the purple. Like, we both, the more blues among us, want to like drag I don't love this binary language, but it's what we have to work with. We want to drag the more conservative people with us. We're like, no, you have to think this way, otherwise you're not Christian. And then the conservatives among us were like, no, you need to like renounce all of that, otherwise you turn your back on God. We're so often trying to control each other. It's just not our job. It's not our job to do that. Like, really trust God. Trust the author of your faith to be the author of someone else's faith.
Yeah.
I have one more question before we get to getting to do some book signing and book selling and some one-on-ones with Colby. And it's a rather loaded question, so you know, the harder one of, well, not that wasn't hard, but so right now is a very, and you and I have talked about this before, that Unclobber really addresses the L, G, and B, but not necessarily the T. And this is a very loaded time in our country for folks that identify somewhere on the T spectrum. And a question from a couple of parents in the room who do have a trans non-binary child. How do we, what biblical language or passages are out there or can be used to cite to be affirming towards transgender folks, as well as what is a way or an opening to help someone particularly in this spectrum who has experienced trauma from the church, try to open a door or a window back to their faith? They say the most hardest and loaded question.
I was hoping by a loaded question you'd be like, which mac and cheese was your favorite? I have to like pick one. As far as clobber passages go for those who identify gay or lesbian, that's what my book is about. There's about 6 of them. As far as anything that the Bible has to say that's even remotely close to being like anti-trans, there's just one. It's Deuteronomy 22:5, and it's this line about a man shall dress properly like a man and a woman dress properly like a woman, or something like that. Like don't dress not like your gender. It's really the only time throughout all Scripture there's anything that's like close to what we are thinking about now when we talk about transgender matters. And that verse is like so easily handleable. It's like, okay, at stake here was deception. These were men who were dressing like women deceptively to get out of war, or women who were dressing like men deceptively. Like, it was about the intention. It wasn't about, again, what we think about as transgender. So that verse is like, okay. Tell me you haven't studied this topic without telling me you haven't studied this topic, right? If you're going to throw Deuteronomy 22:5. In terms of like affirming of the transgender experience, again, I want to go back to let's not ask the Bible to answer questions that it was never trying to answer. But can we extract values from Scripture that help us to orient ourselves in a particular way towards the world? And that's where I think, yeah, certainly the Bible has all sorts of things to say about how we orient ourselves towards people. And they like all center around love. Like, if you want to know how you treat people, you don't really get any direction more clear than love. Which is super frustrating to me because I really wish, I mean, we've got like 2,000 years since kind of the time of Jesus, so the ship has sailed. But I wish somebody would have taken advantage of the fact that they had, like during Jesus' time, I wish somebody would have had the foresight to think ahead and at least just asked Jesus, what's the most important thing? I wish somebody would have asked.
You're right. I'm not sure if
Isn't
anyone
that
asked that or if it wasn't recorded
missed opportunity.
like
All of the Gospels.
all of the Gospels.
Missed opportunity. No,
Uh-huh.
obviously my tongue is firmly in my cheek there, but people did ask Jesus, what's the most important thing? And Jesus said it's love. Okay, so that's a posture.
Love God.
Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Which, and then he would add others like love your enemy, bless those who curse you. Okay.
That's too far.
So in terms of like where a posture begins, okay, but then I hear the follow-up, well, if you love them, you would tell them that they're a sinner. Okay. If you want to do that,
He has a response for that too, I think.
there's a response to that too. If you want to do that, let's just say hypothetically you want to tell a transgender person that they're wrong about how they are relating to their felt sense of gender. If you want to do that, where you must begin, because Jesus actually does, most of the time he says don't judge people, but then he does give one little caveat to that. And the caveat is, if you want to judge someone, first take the log out of your own eye so that you can see clearly to take the splinter out of theirs. Guess what both a log and splinter are both made of? Yeah, it's the same. If you want to go to a transgender person and tell them that they're just a sinner for identifying as trans, I'm assuming you've done the work to take out your own transgender issues with yourself. If you haven't, like you don't get to say anything to them. You know what I mean? Like it's just not your place. Sorry, not your circus, not your clowns. Like it's not your role to say anything. And then to the latter part of that question, to the parents whose trans-identifying child has sort of put distance between themselves and the church or faith or whatever it is.
Which is not like a super uncommon thing for a lot of people that identify somewhere in the LGBT community.
Yeah, the stats are ridiculously high in terms of how many LGBTQ people have church.
I'm just an idiot. The amount of times that people have said things or treated me certain ways, I'm like, it's all cool. God's still good. Humans suck, but God's good.
So to anyone who's in that particular scenario, this is tricky. I'm a father of 4 children, ages 20, 18, 15, and 13. And there's a sense in which this question actually hits closer to home than one might think. And so when I say what I'm about to say to the parents, please know that I'm with you. I am just about one of you, if not one of you. So here's what I'm practicing. What I'm practicing and what I invite you to consider practicing is 1, appreciate the fact that if they have wounds from or pain or negative associations with the church or with a religion, that makes sense. That makes sense. Those are the 3 most healing words that my therapist told me for years and years. That makes sense. They have earned those, the pain that they carry with them. There's a reason why they feel that way. And I'm not about blaming here. This isn't a blame game. But I'm saying when young kids feel wounded by, betrayed by, let down by the church and leave the church, it's understandable in some ways. I think the move for us parents, if and when this happens, and I said it a few minutes ago, is to trust that God has your child. Trust that as much as you love your child, God's going to love your child even more. And know that you could not. If we could control our children, I think we would know that by now. And we know that we can't. Okay, so there's really nothing. I hope this is liberating. There's nothing you can say or do to get your kid back in church. Okay, so let go of that illusion that you have any control there, because you don't. I hope that's liberating. It's terrifying, but I hope it's liberating. You can't control them anyway. So relieve yourself of the pressure by trying to get them back into church. It's not. You can't even if you try.
My child's 3 and I can't even get her to wear a coat. So.
I was watching that. No. She's like, I'm willing to eat this cookie before my macaroni and cheese. Thank you, Mom, so this is happening. And you can't give, and then here's the last thing I want to say, is the best thing that you can do is live your life in such a way so that your child knows that if and when should they ever have any interest or desire to pick back up the faith of their youth, or to return to some kind of church environment, or to have a conversation with you about your relationship with God through Jesus, live your life in such a way that they know you are safe to do that with. And as if you are not affirming of them, you're just not going to be a safe person. So that's a whole different conversation that requires different steps. But if you love your child and you mourn the fact that your child has sort of distanced himself from the church, the best thing you can do is to continue to be a non-judgmental, compassionate, loving presence so that they know that you are safe if and when that day comes. Do you know why the prodigal son returned home? 2 reasons. 2 reasons why the prodigal son returned home. One, Jesus says, is after he had squandered all of his resources and after a famine hit the land, which, by the way, sometimes we miss that famine part and we think, oh, the prodigal son just kind of threw all of his money away and made his own bed and had to sleep in it. A famine also hit the land. You can't control for external forces in life.
Yeah.
Sometimes things that just happen. You can't control when a pandemic's going to come. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Sometimes things just happen. Once you hit that point, the son got that job working for a pig farmer, and Jesus said, when he came to himself, I mean, come on. When he came to himself, when he returned back to who he knew that he was, oh, I'm a child. I'm a loved child of my Father. I'm a loved child. I think Jesus was using this as a metaphor for our relationship to God. Yeah. I'm a loved child of God. He returned to himself, step 1. Step 2, he knew his dad was safe to go home to.
Yeah,
he has no doubt in his mind.
Yeah.
Why? Because his dad, when he came to his dad and said, I want half my inheritance, which is like a shorthand way of saying, I wish you were dead already so that I could have the money that's owed me. The dad's like, all I have is you. Like, he took it. So that son knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was safe to come back home. Does your child know without a shadow of a doubt that you are safe for them to come back home? If so, you're doing everything you can do. The rest, let go and let God. Did I just come up with an amazing bumper sticker? What? Let go, let God. That'll sell.
Do we need to have some copyright material going out?
Yeah, get that trademark going fast.
It's like, yeah. Thank you, Pastor Colby. That was amazing, and I'm sure that there are more questions, other conversation. We're going to continue to have this talk, this work. And for those that have not had a chance to check out either of Colby's books, either both or definitely Unclobber, which Pastor Eric and Daniel just led a wonderful study about, please, they'll be in the back. It's not like that long, right? Like Colby didn't write the Harry Potter series. Like it's manageable, right? Like, would you say, Sandra, like the chapters like go pretty smooth? I'm putting you on the spot, but just making sure you're paying attention here. I'm just kidding. Like it is manageable in the way Colby breaks it up, of breaking down both the Bible verse chapters and kind of talking a little bit more in depth about his story, about how he got here and why it was so important. That it is totally manageable, and I just 10/10 recommend it. And just because I can, I'm going to do a small plug. Colby will be on the 10 Football podcast in just a couple weeks for his second run. If you would like to hear, Colby was, as I told, I was voluntold, he was on my podcast last year. It went well, by the way. I decided to work it out. Colby will again be on the 10 Football podcast here in a couple of weeks to talk about some of these more dynamics and differences and understandings around certain theological topics between maybe more progressive or conservative theological traditions and those around here. So please check that out, and not next week, but the week after that. This is my best system, right?
You did great, yeah. And can I quickly say about the shift?
Yes.
Unclobber is about the clobber passages, right? The Bible, homosexuality. Then the shift is like a survival guide of sorts for the experience of leaving or sort of maybe sometimes being kicked out of a more conservative Christian context. Like you don't identify so much as the conservative Christian perspective, but you want to stay Christian because you know the story of Jesus still means something to you, and so you're on this path towards a more open, liberal, expansive, progressive kind of Christianity. So over the last 12 years, I've been pastoring many, many people that have been making this kind of shift. So this book is about what are the experiences, the obstacles, the things that people run into? Like, how do I think about God? How do I think about Jesus or the Bible or the church? Or what do I do when people in my life think that I've gone off the deep end? Or how do I handle sort of this transition of faith inside of me? So that book might be interesting for some in the room who are on that shift, that this book would be like, oh, I'll find myself reflected in that. But it also might be really helpful for the rurals to go back to understanding, compassion, and love. If you want to understand some of the folks in your community that maybe have, in your mind, really kind of gone way left and liberal, and you don't fully understand that, this could actually be a really helpful book for you to begin to understand why some people have felt a need to shift on from their more conservative roots.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Let's just give it up. A big hand for Colby.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much. Also, if you don't help us bust up a little bit, that's really great too, as we clean up here, just saying. And then for those, please, if you already have books, Colby would love to meet you and to sign them, as well as we do have more books available for purchase in the back. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for staying. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah.